time to put an end to the Liberal inflation tax. Inflation's at 4.7%, an 18-year high, 2.5 times higher than wage growth, and 2.5 times higher than the Bank of Canada's 2% target. What causes inflation? Well, it's the same thing every time. Too many dollars chasing too few goods. Trudeau's thrown out almost $500 billion into the economy, competing for scarce goods and driving up the prices. Price of housing up 1/3, which drives the wealth gap, as it makes rich mansion owners wealthier while preventing working class renters from ever owning a home. Gas is up 41%. Now, obviously, oil prices are determined internationally, but our weak dollar is the result of too much money printing, which means that our purchasing power of international commodities is weakened. The price of food is higher as the government has layered on new taxes and red tape for our food-producing farmers. In other words, the cost of living is driven by the cost of government. Who knew? When you spend more, it costs more. And when Trudeau sent out that $500 billion, it bid up the price of goods, making life more expensive for everyday Canadians. In today's speech from the throne, Liberals must end their inflation tax. Now, there are a number of practical steps they can do to achieve that. Eliminate the $100 billion slush fund of additional spending that they have proposed. Put forward a plan to phase out the deficit. Stop paying people not to work. And re-sign the Bank of Canada's mandate to keep inflation low and to stop printing money. In other words, make more, cost less, paychecks, not debt. Thank you very much.
All right, Mr. Poilievre, Bill Curry here from the Globe. Question, the Finance Minister has a bill on the notice paper for later this week, presumably to implement the announcement she made in October about the $7.4 billion in extensions of wage and rent subsidies on a more limited basis than what was in place before. The NDP says they're not going to support that. Is that something that the Conservatives would support?
Well, obviously, the Finance Committee would have to be reconvened in order to consider a finance bill. We also want to examine the news that FinTrack has found organized crime has used these government benefits to profit itself through criminal fraud. And we want assurances that the government will no longer pay people not to work when we have 500,000 vacant jobs and businesses can't find workers to operate their facilities. It's too early to say exactly how we'll vote on the legislation, but that is an indication of how the lens through which we will analyze it.
From the Toronto Star. When you talk about the deficit fueling inflation, I'm wondering if are you questioning the spending on pandemic benefits throughout the last year and a half that are responsible for the bulk of that deficit? Are you repeating that choice?
Well, you know who also had COVID? The other 19 countries in the G20 who had lower deficits than Canada. G20 countries, we had the biggest single deficit last year as a share of GDP. We didn't have to do that. We didn't have to pay people not to work for almost a year after the economy was reopened when there were 500,000 vacant jobs. We didn't have to give billions to large corporations who already had enough money to pay sumptuous bonuses and dividends to their wealthy shareholders and executives. We didn't have to send CERB checks to prisoners or people that public servants suspected of fraud. Those were deliberate and unnecessary decisions unrelated to the pandemic. Nor did we have to go into the pandemic with $100 billion already added to the debt. And surely we don't have to come out of the pandemic adding yet another $100 billion in spending that is unrelated to the pandemic altogether. Those are decisions that COVID did not impose on the government. They are irresponsible, inflationary expenditures that the government chose to make through its own irresponsibility.
And if I can just follow up, in demanding the elimination of the deficit, I mean, during the campaign, that was a 10-year horizon, which wouldn't show up in any kind of fiscal document anytime now. Are you suggesting that that should show up faster than 10 years, and that it should be in the next budget or the next fiscal update?
We're saying that the government should stop pouring inflationary gasoline on the fire. You've already got 4.7% inflation, the highest in 2 decades. Why add new inflationary spending to that when Canadians already can't pay their bills? I've given some specific examples of how they can eliminate the inflation tax. One is to cancel the $100 billion slush fund that they've announced. 2, stop paying people not to work when there's 500,000 vacant jobs. 3, go through line by line of the budget to find more examples of liberal waste. 4, stop paying money to organized crime and fraudsters through loose, uncontrolled spending programs. All of those things would help us counter the liberal inflation tax and restore an affordable cost of living to Canadians.
Catherine Lévesque, La Presse canadienne. Bonjour, Monsieur Poilievre. Je voulais revenir à la question de Bill au sujet de ce projet de loi que Mme Freeland devrait présenter dans les prochains jours. Votre chef, au mois d'octobre, s'était dit satisfait que les libéraux reconnaissent l'importance de diminuer les dépenses. Donc, est-ce que le Parti conservateur est d'accord avec le principe qu'il faut réduire l'aide en temps de pandémie?
Oui.
Que vous allez voter pour ce projet de loi?
Ça, c'est une question différente. Nous allons regarder le projet de loi, pas simplement les communications de presse que les libéraux, la rhétorique que les libéraux font. Nous voulons savoir qu'il y ait de protection contre la fraude. Nous voulons que le gouvernement arrête de payer les gens pour ne pas travailler. Nous voulons avoir une enquête pour savoir que veut dire FinTrack quand ils ont dit que la crime organisée a pris avantage de ces programmes pour en profiter de façon criminelle. Donc, on va lire le projet de loi pour savoir si ça ajoute à l'inflation que les libéraux créent. Et on va décider ainsi.
Juste une autre petite question. Vous faites partie de ceux qui n'ont pas dévoilé leur statut vaccinal jusqu'à maintenant. Puisque vous êtes ici, est-ce que vous pouvez dire si vous êtes vacciné ou si vous avez une exemption?
Oui, je suis vacciné.
Mr. Poilievre, John Iveson, National Post. Do you deny the Bank of Canada's governor's assertion that these are transitory shocks, supply chain shocks, that will adjust? I mean, we saw lumber prices falling 2/3 since May as the supply chain adjusted. Don't you think the same thing will happen in other areas?
Well, first point, all the inflationist liberal commentators say that lumber prices are cheap. Well, they're up double-digit from 2 years ago. And as for blaming it all on supply chains, does Switzerland have supply chains? Of course they do, but they have inflation of 1.2%. Why is it that countries that are not printing money have very low inflation? They're all susceptible to the same supply chain phenomena that exist around the world. But contrary to Canada and the United States, they're not printing money to pay their bills. This is the inflation we have in Canada is principally the result of too many dollars chasing too few goods, driving up prices. And frankly, you mentioned the governor of the Bank of Canada. Both he and Chrystia Freeland said COVID would give us deflation, not inflation, deflation. And now they're blaming today's inflation on COVID. So they have to decide which is it. They used COVID as a justification to engage in reckless money printing because they said that otherwise prices would drop. And now prices are skyrocketing. So clearly they were wrong, and they have to stop pouring inflationary gasoline on the fire because Canadians can't afford the cost of living.
Do you think we're heading back to the 1970s, 15% inflation rate?
I don't know what's going to. All I know is I can't predict what the inflation rate is going to be precisely, but I do find it interesting that we're following exactly the same folly that both the U.S. and Canada followed in the 1970s. I mean, not to get too far off track, but in the 70s under Nixon and Carter, they started printing money. And so Pierre Elliott Trudeau said, wow, we got to try this up here. And we got runaway inflation of 12% in Canada, a misery index of 24, and eventually interest rates of 20% on Canadian mortgage borrowers. I'm not predicting anything about the future, but I do learn from the past. And the past has proven that when you print money to pay your bills, you drive up the cost of living, you increase poverty and the wealth gap, and that is exactly what has begun to happen. We have time to turn the ship around, but we have to start now. Today's speech should be the turning point. The government should announce an end to the inflation tax.
Hi, Mr. Poilievre. David Thurton from CBC News. It's very good to see you. So you told my colleague in French that you are double vaccinated. Mark Holland, the House Leader, was saying yesterday that there are a number of exemptions in your caucus and that they are that's statistically unlikely. He didn't really tell us how many people in your caucus are exempted. So I'm just wondering, what's your response to that? Are there a number of exemptions that your colleagues are, saying that they have? And if you just want to respond to what he said.
Do you want me? Oh, sorry, I was going to go in French, but yeah, listen. Mark Holland's not a doctor. What he is a politician, and the only thing he's trying to accomplish is to distract people from his inflation tax. I mean, the number one issue facing Canadians that the people want addressed in this speech from the throne is the skyrocketing cost of living. Liberals who have caused that crisis now want to distract from it by talking about everything else under the sun. And I reiterate, the Liberals must announce a plan to end the inflation tax in today's speech from the throne. That's what Canadians and Conservatives are demanding. Mais Mark Holland veut distraire les Canadiens de la taxe inflation. Le coût de vie augmente plus rapidement que dans 2 décennies. Et évidemment, les libéraux ne veulent pas en parler parce que c'est leur politique qui le cause. Donc, nous revendiquons que le discours du trône aujourd'hui mette fin à cette taxe de l'inflation et ces déficits inflationnistes.
Just a quick follow-up. Believe me, I don't want to keep asking you these questions about how many people are vaccinated.
I'm sure you do, but
no,
yes, go on.
I really don't. But so can you put it to rest? How many of your MPs are vaccinated? And the exemptions. Are there any Conservative MPs that have exemptions?
How would you expect me to know that? You think I'm going to pick up the phone and distract from my work fighting inflation to call every member of Parliament and ask them that question? You're falling into the Liberal trap. They don't want to talk about their inflation tax. They want to talk about anything else. And so Mark Holland can pretend that he's a doctor when really all he is a spin doctor who's trying to avoid taking responsibility for the hundreds of thousands of 28 and 29-year-old Canadian kids who can't afford a house and are stuck in their parents' basement, or for the single mother who takes a walk up and down the grocery aisle and realizes she can't afford to put nutritious food on her children's table, or the working class guy who pulls up to the gas station and only fills up a quarter tank because he can't afford to pay the rest of the costs. Liberals don't want to talk about those people. They want to talk about anything else. And that's the only reason Mark Holland made those comments.
Mr. Poilievre, Steve Shear with Reuters. The Bank of Canada said that it won't begin raising interest rates before April. Most economists forecast it'll be more toward the middle of next year. Do you think that's too late?
Not my place to say.
Well,
I have only
concerned you are about the inflation tax.
Yeah.
And one of the levers, well, the main lever used against inflation is interest rates. So
I've only commented on the Bank of Canada's fiscal policy, not monetary policy. And you would be correct in pointing out that the Bank of Canada is not supposed to be involved in fiscal policy. Unfortunately, the Liberals have politicized the Bank of Canada to use it as a printing press to fund their inflationary spending at a great cost to Canadian consumers. The cause of inflation is large deficits that are sending roughly $500 billion competing for scarce goods and driving up prices. The solution is to end the inflationary deficits, and then the Bank of Canada wouldn't be printing the money and driving up prices in the first place. Frankly, these deficits are leading to a higher inflation, and they risk leading to higher interest rates down the road. And that would be a disaster for our heavily indebted country.
So just as a follow-up, the Bank of Canada says it's more supply chains and energy that's driving up inflation. And so I'm just wondering, do you disagree with that? And do you agree with the monetary policy that the Bank of Canada is implementing right now?
Well, the same people who said COVID would bring deflation now blame it for inflation. They were wrong all along. When I warned the Governor of the Bank of Canada and the Finance Minister in May and June 2020 that we would have inflation, they all dismissed me. And now they have been proven wrong, and I have been proven right. That's no longer a matter of debate. That is a documented fact. Look at the transcripts of the Finance Committee, where all of us spoke on this matter. Look at the reported data. The debate is over. Money printing causes inflation. The laws of economics have not been repealed. And as long as the government continues to run inflationary deficits, it will balloon the cost of living, and Canadians will pay the price. That is why, in today's throne speech, Liberals should announce an end to the inflation tax.
You don't want to comment on monetary policy?
I've been commenting on the Bank of Canada's fiscal policy. Right. Well, I generally don't comment on that.
I'd just like to follow up on a comment you did make about fiscal policy and statistics. You claimed that Canada has the largest deficit in the G20. Now you're saying had. That was my issue, because from my understanding from your report from your office, you're citing a report from the early days of the pandemic. That was an IMF estimate that the IMF has since revised several times, and the deficit is actually below the G20 average. So why do you keep using this old, out-of-date projection as your key fact?
Well, because inflation is lags after fiscal policy, and it's true that we had the biggest deficit in the G20. It was 16% of GDP. It was bigger than at any time in the post-war period, and bigger than what was necessary in order to respond to the pandemic, and bigger than the vast majority of our competitors around the world.
Stephanie Taylor with the Canadian Press. Do Conservatives believe, or do you believe at this point, the government should be providing any COVID-19 benefits to anyone? And if you do, can you please get into specifics, like which individuals, which sectors should, if the government in your mind should still be providing COVID-19 benefits?
We think there should be some narrowly targeted assistance for sectors that are subject to severe restrictions on their operations.
Examples of what those sectors might be in your mind?
Tourism and hospitality.
Stephanie Levitz with Toronto Star. Also, just in the example score, what do you consider the slush fund? What are the things that you feel the government specifically ought not to be spending any money on right now whatsoever?
Well, they announced in the previous budget another $100 billion of spending that would go on after COVID. The COVID crisis is behind us. We don't support that.
Like environmental spending, daycare spending, like what specifically do you think needs to go?
Again, we believe we should get back to normal pre-COVID levels of spending. We don't believe that that is necessary to create new permanent multi-billion-dollar programs that did not exist before COVID. What we need to do is get back to affordable government so that we can get an affordable cost of living.
Vincent Gosselin, CKJ 92.5. Monsieur Poilievre, aujourd'hui, votre annonce concerne l'inflation, le retour à l'équilibre budgétaire également. Vous demandez aux libéraux de s'y attaquer. Vous savez comme moi que le discours du trône est déjà écrit et qu'en ce qui a trait à l'équilibre budgétaire, les libéraux n'ont pas de plan depuis 6 ans et n'ont rien promis en ce sens dans la campagne électorale. Pensez-vous que vos demandes vont rester vaines ou vous avez un réel espoir?
Mais j'ai toujours l'espoir. Il faut. Sinon, pourquoi est-ce qu'on continue? Il faut que le gouvernement... J'espère que les libéraux ont parlé à monsieur, madame, tout le monde, qu'ils ont parlé à cette jeune femme qui doit toujours vivre avec ses parents à 28 ans parce que le coût d'immobilier est trop élevé. J'espère qu'il parle à cette camionnaire qui n'est pas capable de remplir son camion à cause de le prix de l'essence. J'espère qu'ils ont parlé à cette mère monoparentale qui n'est pas capable d'acheter la nourriture à cause de l'inflation des alimentaires. Et j'espère qu'ils vont écouter les Canadiens qui sont en misère à cause de ces grandes augmentations dans le coût de vie. Le coût de gouvernement augmente le coût de vie. Quand on dépense plus, on paie plus. Et les Canadiens ont payé le prix maintenant à cause des déficits inflationnistes. Et les libéraux ont du temps entre maintenant et 1h l'après-midi afin de changer de direction. Je sais qu'ils écoutent mon discours maintenant et peut-être ils vont amender le discours pour protéger les consommateurs de l'inflation.